From the Distant Echoes, New Mexico, Episode 18, the Peralta-Ordonez Affair. Last time we wrapped up with Oñate after his resignation from office in 1607 and his final exit from New Mexico in 1608 or 1609, after his replacement, Pedro de Peralta, arrived and took over the governorship. While construction on what would be called the city of Santa Fe may have begun as early as 1607 under Oñate, traditionally is earmarked as having begun under Governor Peralta in 1609, and the town was formally established in 1610. Usually, Peralta gets credit for the founding event. He would also establish Santa Fe as the capital, although Mark Simmons suggests that it may have been moved from San Gabriel to Santa Fe under Oñate. Peralta's main focus early on in his administration was to concentrate the Spanish settlers. This was an effort to make Apache and Navajo raids less effective. Overall, though, the area for Spanish settlement would spread from Taos Pueblo in the north to Senecu, near modern-day Socorro, in the south. However, for the missionary activity, the friars would only spread as far south as Sandia Pueblo for much of the early colonial. As many of the settlers had left under Oñate, Governor Peralta would send one Fray Isidro Ordonez to Mexico City so that he could recruit more friars. Fray Ordonez would return in 1612 with the recruits. Fray Ordonez also brought with him a document that would label him the commissary of the missionaries in New Mexico. While there were questions about the document's authenticity, and later in 1616 it would reveal to be a forgery, Fray Pianado would cede his position to Fray Ordonez. While none of them would know it at the time, this change in prelate would spark much of conflict in the colony for the entirety of the early colonial period. Fray Ordonez wanted to take the colony in a slightly different direction than his predecessor in the secular government. Fray Ordonez thought that the friars should have complete control over the pueblos, instead of the shared method between secular forces like the encomenderos and the missions. Apparently, when he learned of this change, Peralta would exclaim, quote, "Would to God the devil were coming instead of that friar," end quote. Like many of those involved in this new church-state conflict, it was mostly a clash of personality and direction for the colony. Peralta and Ordonez simply didn't get along, and they had opposite ideas to the direction the colony should go. As a result, they couldn't come to a compromise. Fray Ordonez would meddle in secular affairs. One example being that he would give Governor Peralta another forged document that said that the governor should let those who wanted to leave Santa Fe do so that they could establish new settlements. While annoying, for the first year or so, Ordonez's meddling was mostly harmless. However, starting in 1613, he began to interfere with tax collection. In 1613, Taos would claim that they had not prepared their taxes for the year. Ordonez believed soldiers should be sent to collect the tribute by force, whereas Peralta thought that the pueblo should be given another chance to pay their tribute, and he sent the collectors out again. In May of 1613, Peralta sent the tax collectors to Taos. Ordonez would intercept these collectors at or near Nambe Pueblo. Using the excuse that the Feast of Pentecost on May 26th was approaching, he ordered the collectors back to Santa Fe to attend the necessary religious rites associated with the event at threat of excommunication. Peralta would simply order the men to go collect the taxes again once he learned of the event. It was here that Ordonez would produce another document, naming him an agent of the Inquisition. This position gave him wider-ranging authority and powers, including the ability to investigate on behalf of the Holy Office. He would then order Peralta to bring the collectors back at threat of excommunication, giving the governor a 2-hour deadline. Peralta, in his response, would ask to see the document naming Ordonez an agent, while being careful to note by sending the collectors he was acting within his authority. He would also note that Ordonez should have informed him that he was also working for the Inquisition sooner, so that the two men could have worked together. Ordonez would pretty much ignore this request. He would wait the allotted 2 hours and then post Peralta's excommunication on the door of the church. This stalemate would drive a deeper wedge between people in the colony that would last for weeks. Priests would denounce the secular government from the pulpit, and regular colonists would take sides. Ordonez's goal with this seemed to be to destroy Peralta and establish the supremacy of the mission over the secular government. The whole event would last until June, when people on both sides were finally able to reconcile Peralta and Ordonez. All Peralta had to do was turn over some documents relating to the event, pay a fine, and read a psalm. Although the excommunication was solved, the two men continued to butt heads. During Mass one day, the intransigent priest would have the governor's chair removed, Peralta have it replaced in the church. During the sermon, Ordonez would include some jabs at Peralta. Quote, "Do not be deceived. Let no one persuade with vain words that I do not have the same power and authority that the Pope in Rome has, or that if His Holiness were here, in New Mexico, he could do more than I. Believe ye that I can arrest, cast in irons, and punish as seems fitting to me any person without exception who is not obedient to the commandments of the Church and mine. What I have told you, I say for the benefit of a certain person who is listening to me, perhaps raises his eyebrow. May God grant that affairs may not come to this extremity." End quote. That same week, the two sides would again fight some more, this time over who would collect tithes, both thinking they had the right. This was, to Ordonez, another bridge too far. He had had enough, and he began to prepare to arrest Peralta. Peralta would get wind of this plan and gather his supporters. They were going to go to the church to confront the friar. Ordonez went to the church, where many of the townswomen had gathered for mass. Per Perez Huerta, another friar that was present, he would tell the weeping wife of one of Peralta's supporters, named Bartolome Romero, Doña Lucia, to quote-unquote shut up. Meanwhile, the friars watched as Peralta and his armed men approached. The friars would cede the entrance to the governor and retreat further in. Ordonez would exit the convent, see the crowd, go back inside, grab his cane before returning. Peralta would order Ordonez to return to his sanctuary. Words were exchanged, and Ordonez would go back inside, calling Peralta a dog. Peralta would respond with, quote, "I, a dog devoted to God who knows how to kill a friar," end quote. Peralta would then order his men to search the convent. Ordonez would threaten excommunication if the men obeyed the governor, and the governor threatened the priests with arrest if they did interfere with his search. Somehow, a short scuffle would ensue. Peralta would raise his pistolet to fire into the air to try and regain control over the situation. However, someone would strike the weapon, sending it off course and causing it to discharge. This firing of the weapon would end the scuffle, and Fray Pedraza fall over, struck by a bullet. Luckily for the poor friar, it was a superficial wound. Ordonez would retreat back to his base at Quehua Pueblo. Along the way, he would post another excommunication of the governor. A few days later, on June 13th, he would try to get some people together to arrest the governor. However, this effort would fail. With this failure to arrest the governor, Ordonez instead prepared a plan. He knew Peralta would have to send a message back to Mexico City explaining the situation. As he was excommunicated, he would likely have to go himself. So, Ordonez set spies along the route, waiting for his moment to seize the governor. While others would be arrested in the meantime, for the next 3 weeks, Peralta waited to leave. Finally, Peralta would set out. For his part, Ordonez had some work to do. He needed to get a petition signed to allow him to arrest the governor. As soon as he had word, he'd set out for Sandia Pueblo, and the next day he would get the signatures. The priest would falsely sign the document as having been signed in Santa Fe. With the forged document, they had enough pretense to arrest the governor. Ordonez would then catch the governor at his camp and arrest him. Peralta would first be imprisoned at Sandia before he'd be moved to Quehua. While the governor was in chains, Ordonez began hunting any documents Peralta or his supporters may have that countered the narrative. Peralta would remain in his cell until March 14th, 1614. He would then escape his cell. Peralta would spend the next 3 days and 2 nights, still in chains, traveling over open country back to Santa Fe. There he would find refuge at a friend's house. This was not to last, though. Ordonez soon found the governor, put him on a horse, and he was returned to his cell at Sandia, where he was to remain until April 1614 when he was transferred to Ziapa. On May 3rd, 1614, the new governor, Bernardino de Ceballos, would arrive at Isleta. He would almost immediately begin to butt heads with Ordonez as well. He would release Peralta from his cell and begin the governor's residencia. The residencia was a form of formal review that every governor had to go through. This was to help cut down on corruption. Basically, people were allowed to come forward with charges or damages against the previous governor for the new governor to review and judge. During the hearings for Peralta's residencia, Ordonez would attend each to make sure his version of events would prevail. As a result, a lot of the testimony against Peralta would be negative. In November that year, Peralta was finally allowed to leave. However, that was not without one further incident. Soldiers were sent to catch up to Peralta and search his belongings for documents, something Peralta had luckily hidden well. Finding nothing, he was able to continue on to Mexico City, arriving in 1615. Here he would present his side of the story, and Ordonez would finally get a slap on the wrist. The Inquisition would issue the following admonishment. Quote, 1615. Fray Isidro Ordonez, commissary of St. Francis in New Mexico, because, pretending to have commission from the Holy Office, and por causa de Inquisición, he sought the aid of soldiers and citizens against the governor, Don Pedro de Peralta, seized him and held him in chains for 9 months, on complaint of the said Don Pedro, and on basis of information which he gave. Ordonez was brought to Mexico and confined to his convent, but nothing was done, and after giving Peralta a statement that there was no causa del santo oficio as a basis for his arrest, license was given the friar to you as procurator of this province of the Franciscan order, general chapter in Rome. End quote. After this, Peralta more or less disappeared from the historical limelight. The big takeaway from the Peralta-Ordonez affair is that they begin a series of deep fighting between the church and the state, where that they could not reconcile. Mostly this was characterized by clashes of personality, as we'll see throughout the early colonial period. But it also was a failure to compromise on what the goals of the government should be, whether that was profit for the Spanish settlers or solely souls for the church. In 1616, the document making Ordonez the prelate was examined and determined to be a forgery. Friar Esteban Perea would take over as Padre Custodio in 1670. He would be the architect of the early mission effort, bringing into full swing by 1638. Friar himself had arrived in New Mexico in 1609 and would remain until his death. He and Caballos would fight as bitterly as Peralta and Ordonez had. Other changes were also occurring. Isleta was quickly growing into a stopping place for people heading north. In 1650, Senecu was the southernmost mission in the area. In 1618, Governor Caballos was replaced by Governor Juan de Ulate, who would serve until 1625. Ulate's abuses of the Pueblo peoples went above and beyond, including that he practiced Indian slavery, something that was illegal in the Spanish Empire at the time. This harsh treatment of the Pueblos is pretty common across all of the Spanish governors in the early colonial period. Many would buy their office, planning to turn a profit off of their ventures in the province, a difficult endeavor most of the time. In 1621, Friar Perea was replaced by Miguel de Chavarria. Also in 1621, the church in Pecos Pueblo would begin construction under Father Juarez. Unlike most Pueblo churches, which had been integrated into the Pueblo, Pecos's would be a standalone church. Bricks used to build the church were also an innovation on Pueblo methods. They made the bricks for the church in molds, making them more uniform. I'll upload some pictures I took of what remains of Pecos Pueblo and the church to the website, and link that post in the show notes. This church would probably be one of the grandest structures in the colony at the time. I don't have a great place to talk about it, so I'll talk about it here. Spanish influence at Pecos and many other pueblos would often exacerbate existing divisions. For instance, at Pecos, there became pretty much two camps, those who did not convert and those who did. Those who did convert would even dismantle parts of the fortress-like pueblo to rebuild closer to the while not necessarily just along conversion or non-conversion lines, divides would begin to spring up in all of the pueblos, something we'll see again when we talk about the Pueblo Revolt. Ulate refused to support the friars in their mission efforts. He would even go so far as to side with Pueblo religious leaders over the friars. In 1626, Fray Alonso de Benavides would arrive in New Mexico. He had worked to expand the mission field and would later publish his Memorial of 1630. The Memorial of 1630 would go on to be published in 5 different languages before the end of the 1600s. Conversion efforts were often unsuccessful in totality. The priests would often have to settle for a convert who practiced their traditional religion during the week and went to Mass on Sundays. Overall, Benavides' efforts would be praised as it was seen as helping pacify the Spanish frontier. One reason often cited for this failure in conversion efforts is the failure of the friars to learn local. One reason for this failure is that missionaries often spent about 3 years at each, hardly enough time for the priests to obtain fluency in local languages. One exception to this being Father Juarez, who did become fluent in the Pecos dialect, also most likely was why he was more successful than others. Furthermore, Benavides, who served in his role from 1626 to 1629, would serve alongside Governor Felipe Sotelo Osorio, who was actually one of the few governors to maintain good relations with the clergy. Benavides would also expand the mission effort to the so-called Humano Pueblos, Humano being a possible catch-all term for certain plains tribes. Supposedly, the Humanos had also been the ones to see the appearance of one Maria de Agreda, a mystic in a convent in Soria, Spain. Supposedly, she had appeared before the Humanos and convinced them to convert. The story was that the Humanos had traveled to Isleta Pueblo to beg for conversion, because the friar there, Fray Juan Salas, had stood up to them and earned their respect, but there was a lack of friars to preach to them. In 1629, some of the new friars spread the story seeming to have originated in New Spain regarding Maria, and the archbishop had asked the friars to investigate. Until they got the letter, neither Salas nor Benavides had known about the appearances. When asked why they kept coming, the Humanos responded about Maria appearing before them. When some friars went to investigate, they agreed with a cross and procession, which they claimed that they had been taught by Maria. In 1630, after returning to Spain, Benavides would visit Maria and was able to get detailed answers to his questions about New Mexico and the Humanos. Some of his questions were probably leading. Of course, this story fit perfectly well with the story that Benavides was trying to promote in the mission field, so he may have not pushed back too much as well. Perea would return to his role as prelate in 1628, bringing back the conflict between church and state. Perea would stay in this role until the end of the 1630s, when he would give it up to Cristobal Quiros, although Perea would remain agent of the Inquisition. Governor Francisco Manuel de Silva Nieto, who served from 1628 to 1632, apparently got on well. With his help, the missions would expand to Acoma, Zuni, and some Hopi pueblos, the governor even going on an expedition to visit these pueblos. However, due to business in Santa Fe, he was forced to leave early and would leave an inscription at El Moro. I couldn't find one source that gave it in both English and Spanish, so I got it from 2 different sources. One in Spanish from UNM, and another in English from the National Park Service. Both are linked in the show notes. In Spanish, his inscription was, quote, Aquí, Rondor Don Francisco Manuela de Silva Nieto, y días imposible tiene y sujeto su brazo indubitable su valor por los carros del rey nuestro Señor, cosa que solo el puso en este efecto de agosto de 1629, que viene cuni pase y la felieve, end quote. In English, although it doesn't rhyme as well, quote, here was the governor, Don Francisco Manuela de Silva Nieto, whose indubitable arm and whose valor have now overcome the possible. The wagons of the king, our lord, a thing he alone put into this effect. August 629, that one may well to Zuni pass and the faith carry. End quote. The governors that followed, Francisco de Mora, Francisco Martinez de Baeza, and Luis de Rosas, would be problematic overall and known for their corruption, and they continued to fight the clergy. Of those, the only one we really need to spend time on is Governor Luis de Rosas. Governor de Rosas was a crony of the Marquis de Carrerita, who had given him a free hand to deal with the friars. He offended the friars who had not liked his predecessor, Governor de Baezas, by letting the former governor off without a strong residencia. Rosas had paid a large sum for the position of governor, and part of his harsh reputation was due to his efforts to profit off his governorship. He would set captured Indians to work in cottage industries like weaving. He also made war against the Plains tribes such as the Navajos and Apaches, not to make the colony safer, but instead to set captured prisoners to work in these industries. He would also drive new divisions between the church and the colonists. For instance, his war against the Apaches disrupted the regular flow of trade through Pecos, which made the conversion efforts more difficult for the friars. The encomendero of Pecos was Portuguese, an area that had been a hotbed of dissent in the Spanish Empire at this point in time. To prove his loyalty to the empire, this encomendero had refused to criticize the governor, creating a rift between himself and his friend, Father Juarez. Furthermore, just like with other conflicts during this period, the Spanish recruited many Pueblo warriors to help bolster these numbers. This participation taught the Pueblos, despite cultural and linguistic differences, how to work and fight together as a unit, a result the Spanish would come to regret. Friars were quick to act against these insults from Governor de Rosas. Preparing a report against the new governor, they claimed that de Rosas had attempted to destroy their privileges, immunities, and authority. Correa's death in 1638 slowed progress while they waited for another agent to be appointed, which would take 2 years. This left all the power of the church in the prelate's hands. The governor's open hostility to the friars had emboldened some pueblos to even go as far as to kill their friar. Things would get worse. In 1639, one Sebastian de Sandoval would slander a priest and be excommunicated. Rosas refused to force Sandoval to make nice and get absolution, which encouraged Sandoval's action. In 1640, Sandoval's body would be found. Rosas would have the man buried by a different priest while one of the priests was out. Many priests refused to allow a body on holy ground if it had not had absolution and was executed. The priest that did bury Sandoval would be arrested by the prelate and then forcibly saved by Rosas. The whole affair won over some frontiersmen to the church's side, who were already unhappy with Rosas. They fortified Quewa and challenged the governor's authority, although this amounted to little more than a year-long standoff. In 1641, Juan Flores de Sierra y Valdez would become governor. Cabildo was won by the anti-Rosas factions, and Salas became agent of the Inquisition. Then Governor Sierra would die. Immediately, the anti-Rosas faction moved to have Rosas arrested. De Rosas managed to contact Flores' son, entrusting him with his last will and testament. Rosas' enemies would fabricate the incident as well, such as creating the appearance of the governor having an affair. In January 1643, a colonist and witnesses discovered his wife under Rosas' bed. She promptly confessed that while her husband had been gone, she and Rosa had been lovers, and it was an open secret. That night, the aggrieved husband and 4 masked men snuck up to the house where Rosas was imprisoned and killed him. Most likely, this incident had been a setup. Sometime during all these events, Sandoval's body would also be disinterred. Word of this assassination would reach Madrid. Alonso Pacheco de Arida would be sent to become governor with secret instructions to punish those guilty. In July 1643, he had 8 soldiers beheaded, and their impaled heads were displayed in the plaza. He also ordered that Sandoval be reinterred. This affair had nearly plunged New Mexico into a civil war. I think I will leave things here, as this is pretty much the high watermark of the church-state conflicts sparked by the Peralta-Ordonez Affair. While it would never really get more violent than the murder of De Rosas, it's still going to continue throughout the early colonial period. Furthermore, as the church, settlers, and governors fought, the pueblos became restless. Overall rebellions at that time had been small and proved easy to put down. And moving into the late 1650s, the conflicts would calm down. Some of these rebels would supposedly go as far as to ally with Plains tribes like the Apaches and Navajos to help push the Spanish out. This would be a common claim for most rebellions, and may or may not have been true.
If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. And thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.